Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Week Unspun, a weekly live look at the news through a PR lens. My name is Fazana Badwal in London.
My name's Doug Downs in Canada's Rockies.
I'm David Gallagher, back home in London.
Now, what do we have in store for you this week? We are tracking how people with power react to uncertainty and what they're choosing to say or not to say. Our lead story is going to be from the US and what business leaders are signaling and avoiding as policy shifts accelerate. Then we're going to zoom out to the political layer with PM Starmer in China, the EU in a trade deal with India, and we may be seeing this early shaping of new alliances, this new world order that everyone has been talking about. And also, how do public sentiments weigh in when these policy pivots are faster than people can keep up with? And then we're going to discuss Barry Weiss, the editor-in-chief of CBS News, what her story reveals about modern journalism, where it's heading. And as always, please feel free to drop your thoughts in the chat. Do give us your comments, and we're going to try and go over them before the end of our show. Over to you, David.
Hey, thanks, Farzana, and good to be back. Good to see you as well, Doug. As you know, I spent 2 weeks in the U.S. where really all eyes, all cameras were on Minnesota and the events unfolding there. And if you don't know what was happening there, the state's in the middle of a gigantic federal immigration enforcement surge, which led, sadly, tragically, to the shooting of two protesters in Minneapolis. Now, we've talked on this show a lot about this idea of strategic silence. And this is this idea that companies, the business sector in particular, often tries to stay out of the political fray. They don't want to comment on political or policy issues, especially if that runs risking the ire of the Trump administration or the MAGA movement. And I think you could kind of understand why they would stay quiet. However, after a lot of pressure from employees at some big Minnesota-based companies, some investors, and some other stakeholders from the business community, more than 60 Minnesota CEOs representing big businesses like Titan, Best Buy, General Mills, and United Health released a joint letter of protest, really, through the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, calling for the immediate de-escalation of tensions, urging state, federal, and local officials to work together on real solutions. So some might say that was too little, too late, but I actually think it raises a couple of questions. And the reason I wanted to raise it on the show today, because it kind of gets to what we do. You know, we give advice to companies like this. It's one thing for us to play armchair West Wing political advisors. It's another thing for us to talk about actual corporate PR advice that we might give. And I think we might be asked to give opinions on how to deal with this. So kind of a two-part question, and maybe I'll do this first with you, Farzana, and then with Doug. But I think this Chamber of Commerce letter of 60 approach, it's kind of a standard corporate response to a touchy issue in terms of giving them some sort of herd immunity. You know, nobody can get singled out, but they can look in solidarity with their peers. So I think that's interesting. I want to get your take on that. And then Doug, I want to come to you maybe with a slightly different angle on that, because I think it raises maybe a different strategic approach. But is this normal, do you think, Farzana? Was this a good corporate approach to sign on with colleagues?
Well, do you know, I think that there's safety in numbers, and if you want to raise your head above the parapet, there's no better way than to do it with a unison of other heads in your industry. And I think that's where the trade associations, the professional associations, the trade bodies, etc., I think that's where they actually do bring in a lot of value, where they can actually echo and voice the concerns and the issues of the industry. So it makes it look like the members are speaking out, but without the members being sort of, singled out by sort of political actors who may sort of look towards retribution. So I think it is a very wise move, safety numbers. And you've always had it. You've had open letters signed by multiple signatories. So this is just another form and another guise. But I think this is an opportunity really for the trade bodies out there to step up and do their job.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's better than nothing. And believe me, the noise is getting loud. People are asking, where is the business community as our streets are, becoming literally unpassable in some way. So I think it was better than nothing. I wanted to dig in this a little bit further, and I listened to, we're big fans of the Communications Breakdown podcast with Craig Carroll and Steve Dowling, and they used a phrase that I thought was interesting, and they talk about strategic ambiguity. I know sometimes the word's ambiguity is anathema to PR people. It may lack the kind of clarity that we want. But what they mean by this is this idea that when it comes to policy issues or political issues, hot button issues, businesses don't have to comment necessarily on what's happening with the law, the immigration enforcement tactics. They don't even really have to comment on the violence, but they do have a responsibility to talk about safety, especially the safety of their employees and customers and what happens on the premises. So they can remain somewhat ambiguous about the higher level issues, but get very specific about their main line responsibilities. And while that makes me a little bit uncomfortable on some levels, I think that's probably the advice I would give. I think that's where I would go with this. Stay away from issues that you can't win and no one's necessarily asking you to have a point of view on. But you do have a responsibility to communicate about the safety and well-being of key stakeholders like your employees or like your customers. So Doug, I wonder how that strikes you. Is that enough, or is that a step too far?
Yeah, and it's important because you and I sort of see through a slightly different lens, right? You see things through this lens, and I see things through this lens sometimes, but we wear the same pair of glasses, so to speak. I thought strategic ambiguity, great term that Craig and Steve put together. I call it not stepping in it, because anything you say that expresses opinion is going to tick somebody, a big group off, and you're just adding gasoline to it. You know, trying to sit. I don't know, David. I think trying to tell people this is right, this is wrong, not right now. De-escalation is incredibly important. And I said, I think it was last week, the onus for de-escalation is probably on law enforcement. And I'm not saying law enforcement is wrong here at all, but it's probably on law enforcement because that is the professional body. You can't ask the mob to de-escalate, but government leaders have a responsibility to there as well. I thought the silence on perspective was the right move in this case.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, I hesitated slightly. I went back and looked to see what the response was on social media to the letter and to this
criticism.
idea.
Yeah,
and it was, some of the businesses got lit up in terms of how they failed to take a moral stand or an ethical stand. And I'm not disagreeing or agreeing with that necessarily, but I do think if you're giving advice to a business and they've got commitments to shareholders, stakeholders in the community, your job is to help them thread that needle and not necessarily to solve the bigger problem, which remains, but how to protect the interest of their employees and their customers.
I thought the strategy was on target.
Yeah. And also, David, I think, in those situations, sometimes you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. Exactly. And I think what, from a PR perspective, what's important is that when you put together statements in these, highly contentious, polarized topics, it's important to get people who do not have the same viewpoint so that you understand how it lands in both parties. Because often what you see with some organizations is they make a mealy-mouthed sort of statement and they end up winning no friends and they alienate both sides.
Yeah. Well, speaking of damn if you do and damn if you don't, you were at an event this week, right? Talking about rapid shifts in policy and the whiplash it might cause. Maybe take us through what the event you spoke at. I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, so I spoke at a panel and it was really to launch the final report from the Business and Democracy Commission. And that's in part sort of supported by the Chartered Institute of Public Relations, where I'm president this year, as well as Ipsos. And it's been spearheaded by a consulting firm called Jericho. And what was quite interesting is that the room, as you can see, was absolutely full because people are looking for a PR framework to manage and protect reputation through these highly contested times. And as you can see, everyone was sort of at the edge of their seats because everyone's looking for a methodology. And so this report, which is free to download, and we're going to have the link in our show notes and also in our social media comments. And so please do. And what they really identified that number one, populism creates a business risk. Number two, policy failures create costs for business. Number three, poor responses damage reputation and revenue. And also disinformation is a direct business threat. Values alignment is essential for talent, but it's complex. Younger generations much more interested in leaning into a values gap rather than perhaps older generations. And also the opaque lobbying just erodes that trust. And so that was absolutely fascinating. And I think the report, what it does, it actually gives you a framework in terms of how to think about if your organization all of a sudden is in the eye of the storm, how can you give strategic counsel to senior stakeholders in how to respond, whether it's strategic silence or you lean in. And I think that framework is really important because you need a framework to operate from. So, because often when you're in the middle of a crisis, you're in fight or flight mode. And sometimes your sort of cognitive thinking isn't as good as you would like it to be when all of a sudden you're in the middle of a crisis. So having frameworks and developing them that are agile enough that could work from a case-to-case basis is important going forward. Now, speaking of policy pivots and how do organizations sort of navigate it, we also this week saw our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and his sort of state trip to China. It puts the UK and China back into the spotlight. And what's really interesting is back in the UK, you've had this huge debate about China's proposed super embassy, and you've had a lot of protests against it. And what I wanted to sort of try and sort of understand is that narrative gap. You've got policies that are pivoting super quick, alliances that are shifting, which would normally happen over the course of decades, and all of a sudden it's happening within months, within weeks even. And there is a lag because the public are used to China not quite being a friend, but being a bit of a foe, because there's been, many, many years of anti-China rhetoric, for instance, in the UK. And so all of a sudden, our Prime Minister is there looking for cooperation. And of course, the public are perplexed. So I want to ask you, David, how would you sort of advise where you've got policy that is moving much faster than actually the public can keep up with in terms of shifting their sentiments?
Yeah, it's interesting. I re-listened to Mark Carney's speech from Davos last week, which I think we spoke about last week, and I kind of heard it with different ears today, if that makes sense. And one of the comments that really stood out for me was this idea that we're not going through a transition right now; we're going through a rupture. And I think the speed with which we will see changes in policy, changes in strategy, not just at the nation state level, but at the business level, will be really pretty rapid and pretty frightening in some ways in terms of how quickly things are moving. And there will be this lag between public opinion about what they've been told before and where things are going now. I guess what I liked about Starmer's approach, and I know there are people in the opposition who won't like parts of it, but he seems to be moving at two speeds. So definitely he's addressing the bread and butter issues right now. There's some good things have already come out of this, visa-free travel to China from British citizens, no tariffs on Scottish whiskey, a few kind of quick wins that he could talk about. But then he's also saying we need to take a more pragmatic, cautious approach to what are some really real remaining issues with the relationship with China. So I think he's trying to, again, thread that needle between here's some immediate benefits and here's some things that we can we need to work on together. I also like the fact that he phalanxed himself with business leaders who are all there to talk about benefits to shareholders and customers. What the real changes will be, I think, remains to be seen. But we're going to hear a lot more pivots and rapid developments in the near future, I think. And I think that's just the new way of the new normal for business.
And David, I also I thank you for that. I want to bring Doug in because actually you also had the EU and India, and they announced a new trade deal. And so what you're seeing Keir Starmer going off to China, EU going off to India. There's obviously tensions with tariffs with China and India and obviously the US. They're sort of bilaterals. How can institutions like the EU, countries like the UK, actually have their cake and eat it? How can they actually, pursue these trade opportunities and alliances with China, with India, with other countries, and not sort of incur the wrath of the White House?
Canada went to China as well and struck a trade deal. You're just ignoring the islands over here. I get it. I think they can. And it's to frame it to an agreeable value that most, even American audiences would agree with, even Washington would agree with. I think there's a hierarchy to communication. I've always kind of lived by this. You have values at the very top. You have attitudes in the middle. I've got an attitude about taxes, but I have values that sometimes supersede those. Don't like paying taxes. And then opinions that we sort of fight about that really aren't very deeply entrenched. So from a PR perspective, I think you frame this as diversification and resilience and not swapping sides, because that's a value that people would disagree with. On China, the UK line has to be engage where it serves national interest, de-risk where it touches security. On India, kind of easier because it's a values compatible partner. And the EU-India trade deal, the mother of all deals, as they're calling it, is being positioned as commercially significant and rules-based. So brief Americans early, message shared objectives publicly, resilient supply chains, enforcement, national security, fair trade, and then use language that plays well in DC, de-risking, friend shoring, rules-based trade, no tech leakage. Because the White House backlash isn't going to be about trade existing. It's going to be about trade being framed as a pivot away from the US. Diversify your trade, not your values. Put really simply, it's okay to de-risk. Just don't defect. Those are my thoughts on it.
I like
and I think I want to transition over to Barry Weiss, the new CBS News lead, because I think this could be a pivot point for journalism. Barry Weiss built a following by criticizing mainstream newsroom acceptable views and really coming to the forefront now. You may not know the history of Barry Weiss, but longtime journalist, media entrepreneur. Now she's taking on a very different role. She's leading CBS News editorially. And that matters because CBS isn't just another news outlet. It's one of the last household name news institutions that people still associate with the news. Walter Cronkite, and that's the way it is. That's why this is starting to get attention. Earlier this week, an internal address that Weiss gave to CBS News staff started circulating on social media and screenshots. And once that happened, it stopped being an inside baseball newsroom story, and now it's a public one. Is she admitting that journalism is broken? In effect, yeah, she is. The tone's unmistakable. If CBS keeps doing what it's doing, it loses. And she's making a bet on what the fix is. In that internal address, she makes a few tight points. First, she acknowledges skepticism about her leadership and says she's not asking for trust. She has to earn it. Second, she argues we're living in a moment of overwhelming information and somehow we understand less. It's probably due to the disinformation that's out there. And third, she says CBS has to stop thinking like a linear television network. Amen. It's no longer competing for ratings. It's competing for attention across every screen. So how important is the Barry Weiss story to modern journalism? I think it matters in two ways. First, as a bellwether, this is a real-time test of whether a legacy newsroom can remake itself for a streaming-first world without losing its credibility. And second, as a culture war proxy battle, people aren't just reacting to strategy, they're reacting to what kind of journalism they think should win next. And the real test for me comes down to three questions. Does the audience actually rise? Do younger audiences come along? And can CBS win attention without turning news into constant provocation? If the answers are yes, this becomes a turning point. If not, still a big story, just David, kind of a different one. But for me, this could be a transition in how journalists begin to think about themselves, but that's going to be a long haul for that to happen.
Yeah, you know, when you first told me about the story, I was a little dubious in looking at this as a referendum on journalism. It's definitely an examination of television news, and if you kind of try to cram all of journalism into television news, linear television news, I guess so. But putting my semantics aside about journalism, I think she's right to say that the way people are consuming television news is much different than it was in Walter Cronkite's day. Just a little side note, I actually attended a seminar that he taught. This is how old I am. He did a special seminar at the University of Texas when I was a journalism student there. So
Walter
Cronkite, story for another, seriously, story for another day. And he may have actually even kind of signaled where he thought some of this was going. But again, I digress. What she's doing, some people would say, is kind of foxifying CBS. She's giving it a more center-ish, center-right.
Well, center is good.
Well, you could call it a center, but some of the people she's brought in, I think, are kind of noted British conservatives. But that's okay. She's taking an editorial point of view. I think she's trying to build content around personalities, which I think is definitely a feature of streaming content. You import their audiences into yours, and she's moving away from so-called expertise and into more colorful types of perspectives. And I think that's where she thinks consumption is going. Again, from a journalism point of view, I'll let the journalists decide whether this is the future of the trade or not. From a business point of view, I think she has a point, and this is how people consume news now. They don't tune in to the evening news. They don't wait for the show. They just stream constantly. They scroll constantly for whatever is the most attractive, attention-grabbing video, and that's how things are now.
Or they wait for the live stream that has the PR lens to what the news is. For example, do you sit and watch the news, or are you there's no way you would be a scroller on the train as you're heading to your next thing?
I mean, my God, I remember back in the day, I used to get a physical newspaper, and I was quite linear about it from front. I would studiously avoid the sports section, but apart from that, I worked through the whole paper. And so I think it's gone from linear to just scatter. So exactly. Whatever, and it's a little bit serendipitous now. There's sort of the news stories that get my attention. It's not really down to here's a particular outlet that I like because I'm on the left or I'm on the right, and I'm just going to read it religiously from front to back, and give them in essence control over my sort of worldview. What happens now is I'm on countless WhatsApp groups. It depends on who decides to read a news story and share it, and then it will appear in front of me. I scan through different sort of apps, and wherever my sort of attention goes, and through conversation, people, did you hear the story? And then I'll do a little search on, I don't know, Google News or Apple News to see who's written about it. So it's very fragmented, and of course it sort of leads us into, I think, this book that was written in the past called The Merchants of Attention. And I think what's happened is journalists have to become a bit more sort of competitive, because they had it good for a long time. They had it good. They were not competing. Now they're competing with multiple screens. And I think that, and I think it's quite sad, because I mean, I love journalists and I love journalism, and I think it's a very important critical pillar in our society. And without it, we are all much poorer. And if you look at the BBC, their sort of mandate is to inform, is to educate, and it is to entertain. And now the fact is that what's going to get you eyeballs is not necessarily the inform and the educate bit, but the entertainment bit. And so this high-minded journalism that BBC has, which I think is so important for society, I think, the inform and the educate, quite frankly, you have to compete with, other platforms that are completely geared up to grabbing your attention. And you're also competing with sort of influencers who are anonymous, who can say what they want when they want, even if it's true or not true. They don't care. They get the eyeballs. So it's a very, very unfair, and it's not a level playing field anymore with traditional journalists and influencers, because with traditional journalists, they say something is wrong, you can haul them over the coals. Look what happened with the BBC. You cannot do that with some anonymous person that is tweeting away, saying all sorts of unfair and untrue allegations.
Yeah,
I teach a course. If I can just say, I teach a journalism course with graduate journalists in Rome, and these are I won't say kids, young students from around Europe. And to a person, none of them has the ambition of being a traditional journalist. They all want to stand in front of the camera and basically be a news influencer,
be a broadcaster.
They want to be a broadcaster. They want the training. They want to understand how to put the package together. They want to, in my words, appear to be a journalist, but they don't really care if they've got the BBC or CNN chyron underneath them. And so I have faith that the next generation will rise to the technological or attention-grabbing challenges, but it's going to look a lot different than what we grew up with.
The only solution, David, is you give them my card because they should start a podcast. But
I tell them that every time, start a podcast.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
Well, speaking of how we come across and on different platforms and channels, I did tune in to Stories and Strategies, and you spoke to Liz Brooks. Yeah. Great story, or great conversation with her, and about how what I took away is you present yourself consistently, but you're received differently, kind of depending on who's watching and how they're watching you. And I thought that was a good wake up call for all of us as we think about our own personal brands or how we try to come across.
I think you teed it up personally. Let's share a short clip of what Liz had to say, because she's talking about how your ex audience might see you
One thing
differently
that
from your
people
YouTube audience.
get wrong when it comes to all of these multiple platforms and different types of content isn't that you don't have to change your brand or create a bunch of multiple personalities or multiple contexts, you know, for all of these different things. You just have to change the format. Also, I think, you know, with TikTok, LinkedIn, podcasts, all of those things, you have to keep in mind that people are showing up in different emotional and cognitive states. They're showing up for different reasons. So, you know, like with TikTok, you need to make it a little bit more grabby, a little bit more entertaining versus LinkedIn, where people are trying to look for learning and authority. You know, that's more where you can show that different, more professional side of yourself.
So Liz had two keyboards behind her, and this idea of your message can be the same, but it can feel different. Think about it as playing the same music on different musical instruments, right? That it's essentially the same. The feeling is just different. That's the story that's out there right now. So let's go to the mailbag, so to speak, or the comments that we got. This one's from Arnab Chowdhury. Arnab, I hope I'm saying your name right. The font is really small. Opinion versus news will be a challenge when one wants to be a broadcaster. Is that an existential threat? If people we are perceiving as journalists actually perceive themselves as broadcasters or influencers, whatever term you want to use, yes, because journalism is needed in a functioning democracy. We need an independent body with no axe to grind and only the will of the people to share information and allow the people to make up their own minds. Okay, that's called critical thinking. And that was the concept that evolved from early newspapers, because early newspapers were all like this. They were all about telling people how to think. But in the early 20th century, that evolved. And David, that must be part of the course that you teach as well.
Yeah, no, and I agree. It is an existential threat to democracy and to a free market. I mean, we have to have access to real information, whether you call those facts or not. We have to have access to legitimate information. So yeah, it's going to be a bumpy ride, I think, for the foreseeable future.
Arnab, thanks so much for the comment. Time to wind us out. Thank you so much for sharing a bit of time with us, whether it's your afternoon in the UK with your second pint, or in the morning over here on the island with your second coffee. I appreciate your time. As always, thanks to superstar producers Emily Page and Solomon eBay, who flew solo today. Oh, we got another comment here as I'm winding down from Kevin, my journalism school teacher and old mirror guy, said, people make news. That has not changed. Yeah, I would say absolutely. The Week Unspun is a co-production of Curzon Public Relations, Full-Gate Advisors, Stories and Strategies podcasts, recordings on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Give them a listen. And our final thought for today. Most conflict is two people with fear trying to feel safe at the same time. Have a safe and happy weekend. Cheers.